I was never one for solo camping trips, but in the fall of 2017, I decided I needed some time alone in the woods. I had just turned 32, and life had been a whirlwind of work, stress, and feeling disconnected. I thought spending a few days out in the wilderness would help clear my mind. I picked a national forest in Pennsylvania, a place known for its thick trees, quiet trails, and serene atmosphere. The idea was to disconnect from the world. No phone, no emails, just me and the outdoors. The drive to the forest was peaceful. The autumn leaves were at their peak, a brilliant mix of orange, red, and yellow. I parked my car in a small lot near the trailhead, grabbed my gear, and started walking. The plan was to hike about 5 miles in, set up camp near a stream, and spend a couple of nights there. It was a weekday, so the area was quiet, and I didn't see any other cars in the lot. The trail was well marked but rugged. I liked that, less chance of running into crowds. I carried a heavy backpack filled with everything I'd need: tent, food, water filter, and a small camping stove. The air was crisp, and the forest smelled earthy and fresh. Birds chirped above me, and squirrels darted across the trail. It was exactly what I'd hoped for: peaceful isolation. About 3 hours into the hike, I reached the stream I'd marked on my map. The water was clear, flowing gently over smooth rocks, and surrounded by a flat area perfect for setting up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the evening. As the sun dipped lower, the forest grew quiet. Sitting by the fire, I stared into the flames and let my mind wander. The world felt far away. It was comforting, but also a little unsettling. The silence out here was so deep it made me realize how noisy my normal life was. Around 9 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and drifted off to the sound of the stream. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned out, and the forest was pitch dark. The sound of the stream was still there, but something felt off. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound wasn't sporadic, like an animal foraging. It was steady, deliberate, like someone walking. My heart started to race. I lay there, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The footsteps grew louder. They were coming closer. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything outside the tent. The sound stopped. For a moment, the forest was silent again. Then I heard another noise, a low, raspy breathing, not far from my tent. I froze. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be another camper? But why would someone be wandering around my campsite in the middle of the night without announcing themselves? I stayed still, flashlight in hand, listening. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity. Then it stopped. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night, but I didn't sleep either. When morning came, I unzipped my tent cautiously and stepped outside. The forest looked the same as it had the day before, calm, peaceful. But I felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there. I walked around the campsite, looking for signs of another person. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I noticed something near the edge of the stream. Footprints. They were small, like those of an older woman or maybe a child, but they were barefoot, and the thought of someone wandering out here without shoes in the middle of the night sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe some other hiker had passed through earlier in the day, and I just hadn't noticed. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I spent the day exploring the area, trying to enjoy the beauty of the forest, but I couldn't relax. Every sound made me jump. By the time the sun started to set, I decided to pack up and head back to my car. I didn't want to spend another night out here. As I hiked back, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The trail seemed darker than before, the trees denser. About halfway to the parking lot, I stopped to catch my breath and looked around. That's when I saw her. She was standing about 50 feet off the trail, partially hidden by the trees. An old woman, her hair long and gray, wearing what looked like a tattered dress. She was barefoot, her feet dirty and scratched. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just stood there, staring at me. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I couldn't understand why she was out here, alone, looking like that. I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned and started walking as fast as I could. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder. She was still there, standing in the same spot, watching me. I kept walking, faster and faster, until I was practically running. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I threw my backpack into the trunk, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I started the car, I looked back toward the trailhead. She was standing at the edge of the trees, just watching me. I didn't waste any time. I drove out of there as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened. I don't know who she was or why she was out there, but I can still see her in my mind, standing in the shadows, watching. I was 32 years old when I took up weekend woodcutting trips. It wasn't just for the wood. It was an escape from the city noise and the monotony of my job. The fresh air, the solitude, and the sense of purpose that came with cutting logs for my fireplace felt grounding. On this trip, I decided to visit a dense forest a few hours north of Boise, Idaho. It was mid-October 2022. Cool enough to work hard without sweating too much, and the trees were in their vibrant fall colors. I reached the forest on a Saturday morning, my truck loaded with my axe, chainsaw, and enough supplies to last the weekend. The forest here was dense, with towering pine trees and patches of birch and maple. I found a flat clearing about a mile from the gravel road to set up camp. It was the perfect spot, sheltered by tall trees but open enough to let in some light. I pitched my tent, gathered some kindling, and set up a fire ring with rocks I found nearby. By noon, I was ready to start cutting. The first few hours went smoothly. I focused on fallen trees and dead wood, trying to avoid live trees unless necessary. There was a certain rhythm to the work, swinging the axe, the satisfying crack as the wood split, and the dull thud as the pieces hit the ground. I stacked the logs near my truck, knowing I'd haul them back the next day. The sky started to darken earlier than I expected, and by late afternoon, I noticed heavy clouds rolling in from the west. Rain wasn't uncommon this time of year, but I hadn't checked the forecast carefully. By the time I realized the storm was coming, it was too late to pack up and leave. I decided to stick it out. My tent was waterproof, and I had enough food to wait out a night of rain. I quickly finished stacking the wood and covered it with a tarp, securing it with rocks to keep it from blowing away. As the first drops fell, I lit a fire. The rain started light but steady, and the sound of it pattering against the leaves and my tarp was oddly soothing. I cooked a quick dinner, canned beans and some bread, then settled into my tent as the rain intensified. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the forest feel alive. The fire sputtered out under the downpour, and the woods plunged into darkness. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the storm. The rhythmic pounding of the rain was occasionally interrupted by the sharp crack of a branch snapping somewhere in the forest. I tried to focus on the coziness of the tent, but something about the night felt off. The darkness outside was absolute, and the storm masked all other sounds. felt like I was completely alone, or worse, like I wasn't. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the wind or the rain, but a distinct, heavy thud, like something large hitting the ground. I froze, straining to hear over the storm. Then came another thud, and another, slow, deliberate, and closer. My first thought was a falling tree, but the sound didn't match. It wasn't random or chaotic. It was measured, almost purposeful. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the faint beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The forest was a blur of shadows and movement as the wind whipped the branches around. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the sound continued, steady and deliberate. My mind raced through possibilities: an animal, maybe, a deer or a bear. But the weight behind those thuds didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I grabbed my axe and stepped out of the tent, my boots sinking into the wet ground. The cold rain soaked through my clothes almost instantly, but I didn't care. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and I needed to know what was out there. I moved cautiously, shining the flashlight around the clearing. The thuds stopped as soon as I left the tent, leaving only the sound of the storm. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping the axe, every muscle in my body tense. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a heavy branch had fallen and rolled down a slope, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I retreated to the tent, but I couldn't shake the unease. Sleep was impossible. I lay there, clutching the axe, jumping at every sound. The storm began to ease around 3 a.m., and the rain slowed to a light drizzle. Just as I started to feel a bit of relief, I heard it again, a heavy, deliberate thud, this time followed by a dragging sound. It was closer now, just outside the clearing. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of it. The dragging sound continued, punctuated by the occasional thud. It circled the clearing, slow and methodical, as if whatever it was knew exactly where I was. I gripped the axe tighter, my knuckles white, and forced myself to step outside again. The flashlight beam swept over the clearing, and that's when I saw it. A large, dark shape at the edge of the trees. It was hard to make out in the rain and darkness, but it looked like a pile of something. Branches, maybe? No, it was too uniform for that. It looked like a mound of dirt. But why would there be a mound of dirt here? I took a step closer, and that's when the smell hit me. A sickly, metallic stench, like blood and wet earth. I gagged, covering my mouth, and took another step back. The mound shifted. Not much, just enough to make me freeze. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I saw it. A hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out from the mound. I don't remember much after that. I must have run back to the tent, grabbed my keys, and sprinted to the truck. The next thing I knew, I was driving down the gravel road, the forest a blur outside the window. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, hours later. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I didn't think anyone would believe me. When I returned a week later with a friend, the clearing was empty. No mound, no hand, nothing but the woodpile I'd left behind. But I'll never forget that night or the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods. I haven't gone camping since. I never really understood why my grandfather, Richard, insisted on maintaining contact with his ex-wife, Susan. They had divorced years before I was born, but there always seemed to be some unspoken bond between them. It wasn't romantic or warm. It was more like an unshakable connection that neither of them could fully explain. When he invited me to join them on a camping trip one summer, I thought it was strange. Camping with my grandfather and his ex-wife felt like the setup to a bad joke. But I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. I was 24 at the time, trying to figure out my life. A weekend in the wilderness seemed like it could be a good escape. Granddad was in his mid-60s, a retired machinist with a love for the outdoors. Susan, who was in her late 50s, was a quiet woman with a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor. The dynamic between them was hard to pin down. They didn't argue, but there was a certain tension in the air whenever they were together, like they were both keeping secrets. We drove out to a remote area in the Ozarks, far from any towns or cell towers. The plan was to hike a few miles into the forest, set up camp near a river, and spend a few days fishing, cooking over a fire, and enjoying the quiet. The weather was perfect, warm during the day and cool at night, with clear skies and a gentle breeze. The hike to the campsite was uneventful but tiring. My grandfather led the way with his old hiking boots crunching against the dirt trail, while Susan carried a backpack that looked far too heavy for her thin frame. I lagged behind, snapping pictures on my phone and taking in the scenery. The forest was dense, with towering oaks and pines that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. When we reached the river, I was struck by how pristine it was. The water was so clear you could see the pebbles on the bottom, and the sound of it rushing over rocks was soothing. We found a flat area a few yards from the water to set up our tents. My grandfather's tent was small and old, patched in a few places but still functional. Susan's was a newer model, bright orange and roomy enough for 2 people. Mine was somewhere in between, a hand-me-down from my dad. As the sun began to set, we gathered around the fire my grandfather built. He was meticulous about it, arranging the wood in a perfect teepee shape before striking a match. The flames grew steadily, casting flickering light on our faces. We roasted hot dogs on sticks and passed around a flask of whiskey that Susan had brought. It was the first time I'd seen her loosen up, and for a moment, it felt like we were just 3 ordinary people enjoying a camping trip. But that sense of ease didn't last. The first night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was a low, rhythmic thumping sound, like someone hitting a log against the ground. I lay still in my sleeping bag, straining to hear more. The noise seemed to be coming from the direction of the river. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was probably just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to my grandfather. He shrugged it off, saying the forest was full of strange sounds. Susan didn't say anything, but I noticed her glance toward the river with a tight expression. We spent the day fishing and exploring the area. My grandfather showed me how to tie a proper fishing knot, and Susan surprised me by catching the biggest trout of the day. Despite the uneasy feeling I had from the night before, the daylight made everything seem normal. That evening, after we'd eaten dinner and were sitting around the fire again, I brought up the noise a second time. My grandfather stayed quiet for a moment before finally admitting that he'd heard it too. Susan didn't comment, but her silence spoke volumes. That night, the noise came back. This time, it was louder and closer. The rhythmic thumping was joined by a rustling sound, like something large moving through the underbrush. I lay in my tent, gripping the flashlight I kept by my pillow. My breath was shallow, and every instinct in my body told me to stay still. In the morning, the tension between my grandfather and Susan was palpable. They avoided looking at each other, and both seemed eager to keep busy. We decided to take a longer hike that day, venturing deeper into the forest. My grandfather said it was to explore more of the area, but I suspected he wanted to put some distance between us and whatever was causing the noises. The hike took us to a rocky outcrop with a stunning view of the valley below. We stopped for a while to rest and have a snack. As we sat there, Susan suddenly spoke up, saying we should head back to camp before it got too late. It was unlike her to be cautious. She usually followed my grandfather's lead without question. By the time we got back to the campsite, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. We ate dinner quickly and retreated to our tents without lingering by the fire. The atmosphere felt heavier, like we were all waiting for something to happen. That night was the worst. The noises started earlier, just as I was beginning to drift off. The thumping was relentless, accompanied by snapping branches and the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to an animal. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn finally broke, I crawled out of my tent to find my grandfather and Susan already packing up. Their faces were pale, and neither of them looked me in the eye. Without a word, I started packing too. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, which had seemed so inviting just days ago, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves and crack of a twig made me jump. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief. But as we loaded our gear into the trunk, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt near the car. They were large, barefoot, and far too human. We drove away in silence. None of us ever spoke about what happened on that trip. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that rhythmic thumping sound in my head, and I wonder if we left the forest, or if some part of it followed us home. It was late October, and I had been a U.S. Border Patrol sergeant for 8 years. Long shifts in the desert, chasing shadows and sounds, had made me more accustomed to solitude than most people. My job took me to places few ever ventured, and that was fine by me. Sometimes, when the stress got too much, I'd pack up my truck and drive out to the wilderness for a few nights. This time, I decided to head to a remote area in New Mexico, near the border but far from the main routes. It was a spot I'd scouted on a map, an isolated canyon surrounded by rocky hills and scrubland. The plan was simple: camp for 3 nights, enjoy the quiet, and clear my mind before heading back to the chaos. I arrived late in the afternoon, parking my truck on a dirt trail that seemed like it hadn't been used in years. The area was perfect, secluded and shielded by cliffs. I hiked about a mile from the truck, carrying my tent, food, water, and my rifle. It wasn't just for show out here. We'd had reports of drug runners and coyotes using these trails, and I wasn't about to let my guard down. I set up my camp in a small clearing nestled between some boulders. It felt safe with natural cover on 3 sides. The sky was already beginning to change color, shifting from a harsh blue to the warm hues of sunset. I spent the first hour gathering some firewood, arranging it neatly, and setting up a small perimeter with fishing line and bells. It was an old habit from my military days. Anything moving too close would trip the line and give me a warning. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke to the sound of the desert coming alive with its usual noises: crickets, an occasional howl of a coyote, and the rustling of the wind through the sparse brush. I spent the next day exploring the area, keeping a mental map of landmarks so I wouldn't get turned around. There were no trails here, just rough terrain and the occasional dry creek bed. By the second night, I felt completely alone. No sign of people, no distant hum of traffic, just the oppressive silence of the wilderness. It was what I'd come for, but there was always a small part of me that stayed on edge. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. I lay still, listening. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting faint light against the rocks. I could hear the faint sound of the bells on the perimeter line jingling. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to put me on alert. My hand instinctively reached for the rifle next to me. I got up slowly, moving carefully to avoid making noise. The desert was pitch black beyond the campfire's glow, and I strained my ears to pick up any sound. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the wind. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the truck. My mind raced. Could have been an animal, but the pattern was too distinct. Someone was out there and they were close. I stayed low and moved toward the edge of the camp, crouching behind one of the boulders. My eyes adjusted to the darkness as I scanned the area. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was worse. I waited, rifle at the ready, for what felt like hours. When nothing happened, I convinced myself it was paranoia and an overactive imagination. I went back to my tent but didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the perimeter line. 2 of the bells were missing. The fishing line snapped. That wasn't something the wind could do. I found faint footprints leading away from the camp, heading toward the hills. They were human, and there was no mistaking that someone had been there. I debated packing up and leaving, but my pride got the better of me. This was my escape, my time to unwind, and I wasn't going to let some drifter ruin it. I spent the day exploring farther out, keeping an eye on my surroundings. By the time the sun set, I was exhausted but still on edge. I built a bigger fire that night, the flames casting long shadows against the rocks. I kept the rifle close, loaded, and ready. Around midnight, the bells jingled again. This time, it was louder and more frantic. My heart pounded as I grabbed the rifle and moved toward the noise. The firelight barely reached the edge of the camp, and beyond that was darkness. I scanned the area, every muscle in my body tense. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a figure darting between the rocks. It was fast, too fast to be casual. My finger tightened on the trigger, but I didn't fire. I needed to be sure. "Who's there?" I shouted into the darkness, but no answer came. Instead, the figure moved again, this time closer. I could see it more clearly now. Definitely a person, dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured. They stopped just outside the firelight, standing completely still. It was unnerving, the way they just stood there, watching. I raised the rifle, aiming center mass. "I don't want trouble," I said, my voice steady, "but I will defend myself." The figure didn't move, didn't say a word. Then, slowly, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up my gear and hiked back to the truck. When I got there, my heart sank. The tires had been slashed, all 4 of them. Whoever had been watching me had followed me back. There were footprints around the truck, and they led off into the hills. I checked my supplies, everything was still there, but the message was clear. I had no choice but to hike out. The nearest road was 10 miles away, and the thought of walking that distance through the wilderness made my stomach churn. I loaded my gear onto my back and started walking, rifle in hand. The hike was grueling, the sun relentless. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like a threat. By the time I reached the road, I was dehydrated and exhausted. A passing car picked me up, the driver asking if I was okay. I didn't tell them much, just that my truck had broken down and I needed help. When I got back to town, I reported the incident to my supervisor. They sent a team to recover the truck, but when they got there, it was gone. Whoever had been out there had taken it. The experience left a mark on me. I still go camping, but never alone. The wilderness isn't just empty space. It's a place where things happen, things that aren't always easy to explain. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. All I know is that they were watching and they wanted me to know it. It was late August, and I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my head. The summer heat was still hanging around, but the evenings were cooler, just perfect for sleeping under the stars. I picked a quiet spot deep in a national forest a few hours from home. The kind of place where you don't see many people and you can really feel alone. It was just me, my gear, and a sense of quiet I hadn't felt in months. I found a good clearing, set up my tent, and built a small fire as the sun started to dip below the treetops. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and distant calls of birds. Felt peaceful. I had no cell service out there, but I didn't mind. That was the whole point, to disconnect. After dinner, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames and letting my mind wander. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the trail leading to my campsite. They were slow, deliberate. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal. But when I looked up, a man stepped into the light of my fire. He looked to be in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. He was tall and wiry, with sun-weathered skin and a long, unkempt beard. His clothes were dirty, an old flannel shirt and ripped jeans, and he carried a small backpack slung over one shoulder. At his side was a dog, a large, scruffy mutt with a thick coat and an odd limp in its gait. He didn't say a word, just stood there at the edge of the clearing, watching me. His eyes were dark, and there was something unsettling about the way he stared. I gave him a quick nod, trying to act casual, but inside, my heart was racing. I didn't know what he wanted, and the fact that he was just standing there made me uneasy. After a few moments, he moved closer, his dog following obediently at his side. He stopped a few feet from my fire, close enough that I could see the dirt caked under his fingernails and the way his dog's fur was matted and unkempt. He looked at me, then at my gear, his gaze lingering a little too long on my backpack and the small pile of firewood I had gathered. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't sure if he was dangerous or just strange. Either way, I didn't want to provoke him. He eventually turned and walked away, his dog trailing behind him. I watched until they disappeared into the darkness, the sound of their footsteps fading into the night. I sat there for a long time, staring into the fire and trying to shake off the unease I felt. Eventually, I convinced myself that he was probably just another camper passing through. Maybe he was looking for a spot to set up for the night and decided to keep moving when he saw I was there. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. When the fire started to die down, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight. I kept my hatchet close by, just in case, and tried to get some sleep. But every little sound outside made me jump, and I found myself straining to listen for footsteps or the sound of that dog's limp. The night passed without incident, but when I stepped out of my tent the next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Around the edge of my campsite, the ground was disturbed, as if someone or something had been circling it. The footprints were faint, but they were there, along with the unmistakable paw prints of a large dog. I packed up my gear quickly, deciding it was best to move on. I told myself it could have been an animal, but deep down, I didn't believe that. I chose a new spot several miles away, further off the main trail, and set up camp again. The rest of the day was uneventful, and I started to relax as the hours passed. That night, though, the unease returned. As I sat by my fire, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man and his dog standing there again, but there was nothing. I went to bed early, hoping to sleep off the tension, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me, more like a feeling, that prickling sensation you get when someone's eyes are on you. I lay there, holding my breath, straining to hear anything outside the thin fabric of my tent. And then I heard it, the soft sound of breathing, low and steady, just outside. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I reached for my hatchet, gripping it tightly as I waited, my mind racing. The breathing continued, slow and deliberate, and then I heard a low growl. It was the dog. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, frozen, hoping they would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing and growling faded, and I heard the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. When morning came, I packed up and left. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I hiked back to my car as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed, but I never saw anyone. When I finally reached the parking area, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the dirt near my car were two sets of tracks. One human, one canine, and next to them, a single word, soon. I never went camping alone again. I was 28 when I decided to camp alone in Big Pine Canyon, California. It was late October 2015, and I had been itching for a break from city life. I needed peace, solitude, and the kind of quiet only the wilderness could offer. I'd grown up hiking with my dad and knew how to handle myself in the wild, so I wasn't worried. The drive to the canyon was uneventful. The leaves had turned shades of gold and red, and the air was crisp. By the time I parked my truck at the trailhead, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows over the trees. I had a small backpack with the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a flashlight. The plan was simple: hike 5 miles to a secluded clearing near the river, set up camp, spend the night, and head back the next day. I'd been to the area a few times before, but never ventured as far as the clearing. It was supposed to be quiet, untouched, and isolated. Exactly what I needed. The hike started well enough. The trail was well worn but empty, and I enjoyed the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled through the trees. I passed a few side trails and some old, faded signs warning about wildlife in the area. Bears, mostly. I reached the clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The spot was perfect. A flat, open area surrounded by trees, with the river gurgling nearby. I set up my tent quickly, then gathered some firewood before it got too dark. By the time the fire was crackling, the temperature had dropped, and the stars were out in full force. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, staring into the flames as the night settled in. The isolation felt comforting at first. The only sounds were the river, the wind, and the occasional rustle of leaves. But as the hours passed, the silence became heavier. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The cold was sharp, and I could hear the river even more clearly now. I lay there for a while, letting my thoughts drift, when I heard something. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was deliberate, steady, and too heavy for a small animal. I listened for a while, but it stopped. Telling myself it was nothing, I eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly a few hours later. It was pitch black outside, and the air inside the tent felt colder than before. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I lay still, straining my ears. Then I heard it again: crunch, crunch, crunch. Slow, deliberate steps outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding. The sound was close, too close. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, pointing it at the thin nylon walls of the tent. The beam illuminated nothing but the fabric. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed, long, agonizing minutes of complete silence. Then, without warning, something brushed against the side of my tent. It was light, almost cautious, but it was enough to send a surge of adrenaline through my body. I grabbed the small camping knife I kept in my pack and gripped it tightly. When I finally worked up the courage, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The moon was bright, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. First, I saw nothing. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the river continued its soft murmuring. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the fire pit. It was tall and motionless, silhouetted against the trees. My first thought was that it was another camper, but something about it felt off. It didn't move or call out. It just stood there, facing my tent. I stared at it, my breath fogging up in the cold air. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in my tent, knife in hand, listening for any sound. But the forest remained silent. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed up as quickly as I could. The clearing looked ordinary in the daylight, almost peaceful, but I couldn't shake the unease in my chest. As I started back down the trail, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. About 100 feet from the clearing, just off the trail, was a makeshift campsite. It looked abandoned. An old, torn tarp, a rusted canteen, and a few scattered belongings. But what caught my attention was the fire pit. The ashes were fresh. Someone had been there recently. The rest of the hike back was a blur. I didn't stop, didn't look back. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and drove away, the clearing and its strange visitor fading into the distance. I never reported what happened. Who would I tell? The rangers? They'd think I was spooked by a fellow camper or my imagination. But I know what I saw. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At home, I'd catch myself glancing out the window or checking the locks twice. Even now, years later, I think about that night. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods with me, but I've never gone camping alone again. It was late August when I decided to go camping alone. I needed a break from everything: work, the noise of the city, and the constant notifications on my phone. I didn't want to go to a busy campsite, so I chose a remote spot I found through a hiking forum. It was deep in the mountains of Colorado, miles from the nearest town. The forum described it as peaceful, untouched, and perfect for solitude. That's exactly what I was looking for. I packed light: a tent, a sleeping bag, some canned food, a small stove, and a few essentials like a flashlight, matches, and a first aid kit. I also brought my old hunting knife, not because I planned to use it, but because it felt reassuring to have. By the time I parked my car at the trailhead, the sun was already dipping low. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and started the 3-hour hike to the campsite. The trail was rugged but beautiful. Tall pine trees lined both sides, their tops swaying gently in the wind. The air was crisp, with a faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. As I walked, I saw no one. It was a little eerie, but I liked the quiet. By the time I reached the campsite, the sky was turning shades of orange and purple. The spot was perfect: a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a flat area for my tent and a nearby stream for water. I set up camp quickly, eager to get everything done before darkness fell. The forest around me seemed alive with the sounds of insects, distant birds, and the occasional rustling of leaves. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, sat by a small fire, and watched the stars come out. There were so many stars, far more than you'd ever see in the city. It was beautiful. I crawled into my tent around midnight, feeling calm and relaxed. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I made some coffee with the small camping stove and decided to explore the area a bit. I left most of my gear at the campsite, taking only a water bottle, a map, and my knife. The forest was dense, with narrow trails that twisted and turned. I found a few interesting spots: a small waterfall, a patch of wildflowers, and even some deer tracks. As the hours passed, I started to notice something odd. The forest felt different. The usual sounds of birds and insects were gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the feeling of being watched crept in. I shrugged it off as paranoia, convincing myself that solitude was playing tricks on me. When I got back to camp, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My campsite didn't look the same. My backpack was unzipped, and some of my things were scattered on the ground. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but nothing was torn or chewed. It was as if someone had carefully gone through my belongings. I stood there, heart pounding, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I picked up my stuff, checked that nothing was missing, and tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Maybe I just didn't notice it earlier. That night, I couldn't relax. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me sit up, clutching my knife. I kept the fire going as long as I could, but eventually, exhaustion took over. I fell asleep, knife still in hand. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The fire had burned out, and the forest was pitch black. I heard it then, a faint crunch of footsteps outside my tent. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, listening. The steps were slow and deliberate, circling the tent. Whoever or whatever it was, they were close. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. The footsteps stopped right next to the tent, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the tent fabric shifted slightly, as if someone was running their hand along it. Panicked, I grabbed my flashlight and knife, unzipping the tent in one swift motion and shining the light into the darkness. There was no one there, just trees and shadows. But I knew what I heard. I knew someone had been there. The next morning, I packed up. I decided I'd had enough solitude and would hike back to my car. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I stopped several times, looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. Still, the unease grew stronger with every step. About halfway back, I found something that made my stomach churn. A small pile of stones stacked neatly in the middle of the trail. It hadn't been there the day before. It felt deliberate, like a message. I stepped around it and quickened my pace. Then I saw it, movement in the trees ahead of me. It was quick, just a flicker of something darting between the trunks. I froze, gripping my knife tightly. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself. "Just your imagination." But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. The last mile to the trailhead was the longest mile of my life. I practically ran, heart pounding, convinced that at any moment, someone would grab me from behind. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I sprinted to it, threw my gear into the back seat, and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the trail. Standing at the edge of the forest was a figure, a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a cap. His face was in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, watching. I didn't wait. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. Even now, I can't explain what happened. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the way he stood there, watching me, and I wonder how long he had been following me before I even noticed.